The successes of the Russian army on the battlefield have become so obvious that even the most ardent Ukrainian and Western propagandists can no longer hide it from the public. Basically, in their articles and reports, these propagandists try not to address the topic of towns and cities liberated by the Russian army. Instead, they tell their audience fairy tales about some kind of successful operations by Ukrainian sabotage and reconnaissance groups, the huge losses of the Russian army in manpower and equipment, and dozens of destroyed Russian warplanes, ships, factories, and armories. At the same time, they continue to turn a blind eye to the fact that with each release of their new ridiculous article or video, Ukraine is getting smaller and smaller. By the way, today was no exception either. Unfortunately for Ukrainian and Western propagandists, on the morning of January 16th, war correspondents reported another success of the Russian army in the Special Military Operations Zone. In particular, they confirmed that on January 16th, at 9 a.m. Moscow time, Russian troops entered the settlement of Vremyevka and took control of the main highway, through which the Ukrainian grouping was supplied in the city of Velikaya Novoselka. At the same time, it is worth noting that the entry of Russian troops into Vremyevka took place 24 hours after the Russian army liberated the settlement of Neskuchnoye. Judging by this map, it becomes clear that the city of Velikaya Novoselka is in a semicircle and may soon repeat the fate of the liberated Vuhledar. According to war correspondents, the Ukrainian army units have already begun to leave the city in small groups. At the same time, it is reported that the first to flee the city were the so-called foreign mercenaries, many of whom are active duty soldiers and officers of armies of NATO countries. By the way, over the past 30 days, cases of mass flight of Ukrainian soldiers from their positions have doubled. Furthermore, the Ukrainian General Staff recognized a significant rise in the number of mass surrenders among Ukrainian soldiers in crucial frontline areas. Let me remind you that just a week ago, the elite 155th Separate Mechanized Brigade and of Kiev, which underwent military training in France, almost completely ceased to exist. The fact is that the Ukrainian soldiers trained by the French began to flee and surrender en masse as soon as the military command transferred them to the Pokrovsk direction of the front. And today, almost 10 days later, yet another scandal is playing out in Ukraine. So, a few hours ago, a Ukrainian officer of the 143rd Separate Mechanized Brigade, Alexander Ovsy, officially announced the mass flight of 200 Ukrainian soldiers from the 468th Battalion of this brigade. Moreover, Alexander Ovsy stated that there were also commanders among the fled Ukrainian soldiers. According to him, this mass flight of Ukrainian soldiers and officers took place in the Kupiansk direction of the front near the settlements of Vuhledar and Kalanovo. At the same time, it is reported that the Ukrainian soldiers and officers who fled from their positions also received military training in such NATO countries as France, Poland, Germany, and Britain. Commenting on the mass flight of Ukrainian soldiers, the commander of the intelligence unit of the Ukrainian Army, Denis Yaroslavsky, bluntly stated that the NATO countries were to blame for this. According to him, the military training of soldiers in Western countries is simply terrible, and is not designed to create strong and trained soldiers to conduct intense combat operations against a professional enemy army. Moreover, Denis Yaroslavsky also touched upon the topic of the mass flight of Ukrainian soldiers from the elite 155th Separate Mechanized Brigade, who received military training in France. According to him, within a few months, the French turned Ukrainian soldiers into real sissy musketeers, who began to be afraid even of the sounds of ordinary artillery shots. As a result, as soon as these soldiers found themselves on the battlefield, in real combat conditions, they began to flee and surrender. Moreover, Ukrainian telegram channels showed interviews with 2 Ukrainian officers of the Ukrainian General Staff, who bluntly stated that the military training of Ukrainian soldiers in NATO countries not only does not strengthen the defense capability of the Ukrainian troops, but also significantly weakens the combat potential of the Ukrainian army. According to them, NATO soldiers and officers have no experience in fighting against a professional enemy army. Many of these NATO soldiers are not physically and mentally ready for full-fledged combat operations against a strong opponent. These NATO soldiers are unable not only to capture well-fortified settlements, but even to organize an effective defense. Commenting on the words of the Ukrainian officers, reputable military expert and analyst Boris Vremyevka said that he perfectly understands the discontent of Ukrainians. According to him, NATO has never fought against peer adversaries. Western countries, led by the United States, have for decades fought only against deliberately weak rivals, with weak armies and weak air defense systems. Boris Vremyevka noted that NATO countries, and in particular the United States, absolutely do not care about Ukrainian soldiers. In his opinion, in Ukraine, NATO is closely studying the course of hostilities against the professional Russian army. That is why NATO countries continue to send their soldiers and officers to Ukraine, as part of the so-called Foreign Legion. All this is done to ensure that the North Atlantic Alliance gets at least some experience in conducting military operations against a strong rival. At the same time, Boris Vremyevka noted that all offensive actions of the Ukrainian army in both the Zaporizhia and Kursk regions were developed exclusively by NATO generals. As a result, in the summer of 2023, the Ukrainian army suffered a crushing defeat in the Zaporizhia region, losing 170,000 soldiers killed and wounded. And the same thing is happening now in the Kursk region. The Ukrainian army is suffering a crushing defeat in this Russian region, rapidly losing not only the occupied territories, but also manpower. It is reported that as of January 17, 2025, the Ukrainian army had lost 53,000 soldiers killed and wounded in the Kursk region. And at the same time, none of the goals were achieved. Thus, the current war in Ukraine has once again proved to the whole world that in the event of a non-nuclear conflict with Russia, the North Atlantic Alliance does not have a chance to win.